Rahim, I'm looking forward to today's episode. I think there's a lot to cover off when we think about people that are, retiring or entering post-career in a different way. We need flexibility. We need different products rather than a, retirement plan when people come to work and start in their 20s.
Yeah, I think the discussion that I'm looking forward to is we always kind of think about retirement planning as an issue that's near and dear to someone who is about to get into retirement, right? But this conversation we're focusing on people that are just entering the workforce, mid-career as well as late career, and I'm excited to hear about the differences amongst those age categories.
And well, let's bring Tanya in. Okay, today I want to welcome Tanya Duxbury. She's with Canada Life, and she's the Assistant Vice President for Products and Solutions of Workplace Retirement and Savings. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you.
And I'm going to kick things off. We've been doing this with a few guests because we find it helps in our insurance and savings world to have our listeners get to know our guests a little bit up front. So if you could share with us, Tanya, what's something that you like to do for fun?
Well, actually, it's funny because I just started taking up swing dancing again. So about 20 years ago, I taught swing dancing for a bit and have decided to get started. I'm a little rusty though, but no, I enjoy doing that for fun.
And Rahim, any new hobbies since we last spoke, or are you still staying busy with the kids?
Busy with the kids. The newest development at the Pira household is that we are booking our annual vacation. So I've been spending some time on the weekends and evenings doing research, and there's just too many things to choose from. So that's what I'm doing. Hopefully to have that wrapped up soon. What about you?
Awesome. Well, this is a really an interesting milestone year for my family, not for me specific, although I did have a 30th anniversary in the industry. So not a birthday, but a 30th anniversary, which is cool. My brother is turning 50. My uncle is turning 80. And two of my cousins are each turning 60 and 30. So we're having a big birthday party in the summer. So I'm hosting that. So we're busy planning that. So a lot of those milestone. I'm going to get some big balloons, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure you will. It sounds like fun.
Yeah, definitely. Good. Well, let's move into today. We're going to talk to our listeners, our employer plan sponsors, about a topic that just really never gets old around here. We're really looking at focusing in on the retirement savings and retirement and how it's evolving. So, Rahim, what are you hearing? What should we talk to Tanya about?
Yeah, so in the spirit of the whole swing dance, and let's see how we can swing this to a conversation relating to retirement. So Tanya, one of the things when we were prepping for this call that I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on, and this is a little bit of an offshoot around where I am in my life and where my parents are versus where my nieces and nephews are. So I was kind of thinking to pick your brain on, can you walk us through how someone who is Gen Z or mid-career or someone later in their career, I know it's obvious, but what are the things that each of those demographics thinks about when they plan for retirement? And are you noticing anything with your work and work that Canada Life's doing to identify any trends or new findings around how these cohorts approach retirement planning?
No, that's great, Raheem. I love the analogy back to the connecting back to the swing dancing. So I think that's going to be a common theme as we go through this. Yeah, I mean, retirement today, it looks different than what it used to be for multiple generations, but it's not necessarily a new phenomena. Say in the recent years, it's really been a transition and a shifting that's been happening over last 10 or 15 years. But essentially, for all generations, what's really consistent is that they're seeing it really as a flexible stage of life, less as that hard stop, and then, start in retirement. Instead, retirement is more about, well, how do I flex, my personal savings, my personal goals around, around working, and or pursuing other types of work. What's interesting is that, younger Canadians we know right now, their focus is on that build mode, of saving for housing and then also paying down debt and just finding that day-to-day stability rather than the long-term savings. And that's consistent for, your Gen Zs ultimately because they're trying to navigate higher costs, et cetera. Um, and oftentimes we talk about Gen Z more from the standpoint of this being like a new phenomena that they're really facing, having a hard time saving, et cetera. But I guess what I want to call out is that everyone sort of in their 20s goes through that challenging period of, lower income earning. They've got debt, they're trying to save for a house, maybe they're getting married, there's some big expenses that come up. But Gen Z is more inflicted, so to speak, given the fact that, they certainly have higher lifestyle expectations like subscription services, eating out, delivery services. So some of that is driving it, Spotify accounts, all those types of things. Um, but so some of it's lifestyle, but they're certainly faced as well with the fact that, there's increase in living costs as well, and rent is higher and housing is higher and energy is higher, et cetera. When we look at the mid and late career by contrast, I mean, mid career, we often think of them as that crunch generation trying to balance, say, kids and potentially aging parents. And I want to come back to that in a second because that ties into later career employees as well. But with mid career, they're only just starting to think about, say, retirement income, and maybe just starting to think and move away from accumulation. But those later career employees, the reality is that with longevity, with people living longer, it means even late career employees are likely, supporting aging parents. They may have kids still at home as well, or they have kids that are in post-secondary as well, or even boomeranged back. They've left for school and now those kids are trying to support those kids saving as well. So they're also potentially paying down their own mortgages still. Just basically debts are carrying through into later career as well. But they're also now trying to think about, how do I make retirement happen and what does that look like?
Tanya, I think you just literally described me to a T. I'm exactly that. Living and working, I've got my, my mom. I've got a granny suite
Mm,
downstairs. She's 82 this year. I've got my daughter in first year university. And, when I think back to my grandparents and even my parents, my dad, my mom, thinking about, they used to be the stop work generation. You
yeah.
retire and you stop work and you enjoy life. Now we're getting more into this really purposeful flexibility. I'll think on that because yeah, there's a lot going on, depending on the stage you're at. So when I think about people living longer and adapting into this work flexibility, maybe you're not working full time, but maybe it's 4 days a week, 3 days a week, part time, full time, a lot going on. How does this change people's retirement expectations, or I'll call it post career? I've learned that term recently: retire versus post kind of full time career. What does that mean for how we plan?
I love that term actually, because it's a challenge to come up with the right term because, retirement, it doesn't hit, using like it just doesn't hit like it used to, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, you're bang on your situation, where you're supporting aging parents and younger kids as well, like as they're trying to save. But retirement is really more about a tiering of a lifestyle, a phased work or free time lifestyle. And, if you think about it, you've got sort of that earlier stages that are active retirement, and then you sort of slow down maybe into moderate retirement, and then really slow down into late retirement. The challenge there is that there's a lot of variability because someone who's 65, let's say, and they're still in active retirement, meaning they're maybe working 80, 90%. They might just be taking a couple extra weeks off a year because that's the balance they like, or they might take on a full-time job that has less stress, but they're still potentially working, still quite active, or they're active pursuing hobbies, 10 to 15% of their free time. And then, maybe from 65 to 70, that's all great. And there's a steep drop off though, then after, and they might skip a moderate paced retirement and go right to very slow. The other side of it is, my grandmother, for example, is 99. and she's still in the moderately paced years of retirement. And I would say she's inching towards slowly. So she's been in a moderate phase of retirement, just slowly inching gradually down to that slowest stage, that later stage of retirement for the last 10 years, I'd say. So for her, retirement meant that she was really in active retirement for a very long time, 20 years plus in retirement. And so going back to your question just around planning, it makes planning really a challenge. Certainly tools, digital tools that are out there that set a retirement age and help members determine if they have enough to afford monthly income. That's helpful, but it's really just a starting point. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir with your audience as well, but really it's this increasing need for personalized advice and planning. Not everyone has plans, even financial plans. They also don't have decumulation plans. And so our data was actually showing that 12% of our members have an actual financial plan, but the vast majority of those don't even include a decumulation or pay down strategy. So, where I'm going with this is that it's planning for that lifestyle, those different stages post retirement, as much as it's for financial. And it's a real challenge because a lot of members aren't even taking advantage of the financial. So, I think for plan sponsors, it's really about reinforcing and really trying to get employees to understand and take this seriously. And a lot of programs have planning as part of their programs. Asset Canada Life, other service providers offer salaried advice to help, or there's plan level advisors on plans that might offer individual financial planning. And so it's really just, I guess, where I'm going is getting members to really consider and take it seriously and see this as though it's one step that they need to sort of revisit and continue this relationship through into the retirement.
That's great, Tanya. So maybe shifting gears and going back to what you said a bit earlier, and I'd love to get your thoughts more on the younger generation, like the 20-something individual who has student loans, and they probably want to get that under control. They want to maintain a certain lifestyle. And kind of traditionally, we've always honed in on the fact that you contribute early, compounding is on your side. Like we've been very mechanical about kind of a one-way thought around how that investor or that individual should focus on. And maybe we're thinking about it wrong. Like is it possible that they're for someone in their 20s to be better off financially by doing something else?
Yeah, it's interesting because the reality is that for 20-year-olds, people in their 20s, not maxing out their RSP early isn't necessarily a failure. And I think sometimes, and this is, I'll talk a little bit about plans in particular that don't provide, say, a match, right? But sometimes psychologically there's all this emphasis on saving for retirement, but that's not really relevant to this demographic. They're facing different pressures, and then b they have a much longer work span or lifespan as well to save. So what we know in our data is that their biggest priority, right, is they're both short-term and long-term, is emergency readiness and cash flow management. Feeling like they're being pulled into 5 different directions and splitting between, say, high interest debt and then trying to consider long-term savings, it can stall the progress in both buckets. And it can also feel really self-defeating. And this conversation I had with my daughter, she's 18 recently, and she literally said, what's the point? Like, it just feels insurmountable when you have debt and you're barely making an inch on that, and then, trying to save for something so far off. But it boils down to sequencing. And again, working and creating a relationship early, and understanding sequencing. Sequencing is so important because if they can create, say, an emergency fund as the highest priority, that will put them in a position to avoid, say, having to take more debt, and then tackle the highest debt first, pay that down, get out from underneath that, and then increase their retirement savings when there's a bit more breathing room. And by that time too, the point is that they'll have actually higher income as well, and so those tax deductions and tax sheltering will become even more valuable. And again, I did mention before, if there's sponsor matching, then that does change things, because certainly, back to your point about compounding returns and getting really the maximum benefit from your employer is really helpful, but it's about finding that balance. And one piece of data that really stood out to us at Canada Life was savings actually is not the issue. So our 30-year-olds today, they're actually saving more and have higher RSP balances than a 30-year-old did in 2018. And that actually is great news. I mean, that tells me education's working. They're, whether it's from Instagram or through their company plan, the point is that they're seeing the need to save, which is great news. But they're also the highest, they're withdrawing at a much, much higher rate from their RSPs. And that's ignoring things like home buyers and lifelong learning. And so they're doing the right things, putting the money in, but life just keeps pulling back from their RSPs. So that's where some of it is also from a plan design standpoint, that if these younger demographics had access, for example, to TFSAs in particular, or non-registered savings programs in their plan instead of RSPs, they're going to make withdrawals anyway. And instead of shooting themselves in the foot and using up their RSP room because they're making that withdrawal today and then making that saving today and then withdrawing it from their RSP, something like a TFSA would not use up that future RSP room and not sort of hurt their retirement savings down the road and really affect the amount of retirement room.
Tanya, I am so happy to hear that stat you shared about the difference in, savings that's taking place in people in their 30s. But you really hit something so important. I think both from a plan design standpoint and psychologically, like when someone is doing the right behavior in saving and then, doing something that people would generally say, oh, don't do that, withdraw from retirement. It's a matter of actually expanding and making the plan design different so that you can feel good about saving and not feel bad about withdrawing because of those life happens and savings. So that leads me to this question is, helping an employer really stand out. And I'm talking to the employers listening right now, the plan sponsor employers. What can they do to design a plan now that is going to address all these different ages and stages of life to really feel like everyone has been taken into account in what they need to do to save both long-term and short-term? Let's talk about that.
Yeah. And I like to think of it as, it's important to look at the commonalities across the board, right? So, because it can kind of feel, excuse me, you can kind of feel like, can I be everything to everybody? And how do you create this plan? And sometimes there's even the conversation around, well, it's a retirement savings plan, so introducing things like TFSAs or non-registered accounts, or even more discussions around FHSAs and things like that, that contradicts, say, the theoretical position of the retirement plan. We should offer RSPs only, and where I'm going with that is that if we think about it as though back to the younger demographic, those withdrawals impact their retirement savings down the road. So if we think of it more as though, well, how do I financially, collectively set people up to achieve retirement outcomes ultimately? And I would say from a plan design standpoint, if you focus on the commonalities, I mean, certainly, debt. So it's flexibility, right? Being able to flex savings, it's directing employee contributions to a TFSA and employer contributions to an RSP, or not basing eligibility based on, say, full-time years of service, so that if it's based on part-time or hourly or something of that nature, then as people move into retirement, they're able to still participate in the plan. But it also equally benefits early career or mid-career folks, particularly women too, who might be on leaves or take reduced hours, et cetera. I would say too, features like auto enrollment, it really makes it less painful for people to enroll, in the sense that they don't have to complete any steps to enroll. You just enroll them at a certain contribution rate, and that money then comes off the top before employees even see the money. And then part of it too is just working with, whether be with a service provider. And I don't want this to be a shameless promotion of Canada Life. I know that we're unique in the industry, that we offer things like credit counseling and student debt savings programs. And so I recognize that a lot of service providers don't, but EAP programs do offer those. And so employers can also, some of it is about just reshaping the focus of the marketing and the promotion around those programs, because oftentimes employees are thinking of EAP in the lens of emergencies only, or therapy, which is all good, but they often offer a lot of credit counseling, financial management, et cetera, within it. I think there's already some structures that sponsors can, some levers they can pull, but then there's certainly those plan design approaches as well.
Yeah, I think there's been so much in this episode that I think what I'm hearing the loudest and the clearest is that, when I'm a new employee in my 20s, dialing back the years of decades, joining a plan, if I arrive and I see a booklet that says, I'm here to help you save, period, like not retirement savings, not, necessarily homebuyer, but it's everything. So Rahim, my final question as we wrap up this episode is for you. What are you taking away for how you talk to your clients, your plan sponsors, and their employees about flexibility in programs, and really, really leveraging all the tools that Tanya just said about EAPs and advice and psychology and support to really build confidence?
Yeah, and this is not to toot our own horn or pat ourselves on the back, but we've always consulted keeping in mind that client specific need. So if you have a business that's a startup business, is hiring a lot of young coders or whatever it is, the way they would design their program would be very different than maybe a business that has a very mature workforce that's past the home buyer's plan stage, etc. I think in summary, I think plan sponsors, it would be a good idea to focus on designing a plan that's flexible, that's not rigid, because today's employees require flexibility. And I think, as Tanya alluded to, a 20-year-old's needs are very different than, someone who is at age 50, 55, where they're focusing on how to get to the next 10 years. So all this to say, consultation and plan design should be unique to each plan. But really enjoyed today's conversation with Tanya. I think our plan sponsors will too. And I think what we should leave our plan sponsors with is, you can be bold in terms of how a plan can be structured. It just doesn't have to be an RSP matching where both employee and employer contribution go into one plan. It can be a TFSA. It could be a non-reg if people don't have RSP eligible room yet. It could be a DC plan. It could be, pay back your student loan plan when a carrier supports that. Lots of flexibility, and it is important that we focus on all age cohorts that we're designing the plan for.
Wonderful. Yeah, I agree. This episode has really helped show that we can break not only the tradition of moving from full-time work to purposeful flexibility as we do post-career. And I did grab that from Tammy Vigu in our industry. She's great for terminology. But to hear that Canada Life and Tanya, the work that you and your team does to help create that flexibility to meet everyone at all stages is great. I'm thinking, Rahim, we do another episode and we dive deeper than we did today. But this gives everybody
Tanya off the hook with one parting gift. Like, are we not going to do that with her?
We should. So Tanya, I'll put you on the spot. What is a TV show, a Netflix episode, or a podcast you are currently listening to that you would recommend to our listeners before we say goodbye?
Start, Tanya, while you're thinking. For me, I'm very late to the party, but I started watching The Pit on Netflix. So kind of a hospital ER type show. It's really well written and very well acted. It's called The Pit, PITT, I believe.
Right on.
Tanya, over to you.
Never heard of that.
I can go if you want. I'll share mine and then we'll come back. Okay. So this actually fits this episode. So I you have that guilty pleasure series that you watch that's just, brain candy. So this one is called Younger. And it's about someone who has to actually lie about their age to get a job at a publishing company. And so I'm thinking of all the ages and decades that we talked about today. But it's quite entertaining. It's a good little drama comedy type of thing.
Wow, it's the other way. Like when we were kids, it was a fake ID to get older, to get into a nightclub. We're doing the opposite here.
Exactly.
I guess what I would say, the podcast, that's why I'm just a little reluctant to share it. But I mean, the podcast that I've been listening to is Chris Terrell, which is, he's more focused on, I've taken a lot of focus on my health and fitness. And so I've sort of moved into, I've learned about him essentially, talks about eating, and it's just a lot more serious than the two that, you were going with. But anyways, I think what I need to do is have more fun things to watch. And you've given me some things to actually watch on TV. But yeah, since
hey, you're swing dancing. You're swing dancing, so right. You're all good.
Yeah.
But back to on a serious note, thank you, Tanya. We'll definitely have you back for a part 2 to dive deeper, but loved hearing about the flexibility that's out there. And we will be in touch to hear part 2. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you both. It's been great.
This has been the Benefits Alliance Voice. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your network and be sure to check out the podcast notes for any additional materials.